My name is Emily Grace Carter, and this is my story. Growing up in rural Iowa wasn't easy, but I never expected life to be fair. I just wanted it to be kind. Our family farm sat on 80 acres outside Bloomfield, surrounded by cornfields, rusted fences, and the same people who never seemed to change. I was the youngest of 4, and the only girl. My brothers, Jake, Matthew, and Cole, were loud, reckless, and constantly praised for it. I, on the other hand, was quiet, careful, and forgotten. I learned early that love in our household came with conditions. My father believed sons were built for legacy and daughters for marriage. Boys inherit, he used to say, spitting tobacco into an old coffee can. Girls marry well. My mother, sweet but tired, never challenged him. She faded into the background of our home, much like I did, but I worked. God, did I work. By age 10, I was waking up before sunrise to feed the chickens and gather eggs. At 12, I was mending clothes, balancing checkbooks, and helping Mom cook meals for a house full of men who barely said thank you. When harvest came, I was in the fields just like the boys, hauling feed, stacking hay, wiping sweat from my brow, but my effort was never acknowledged. Jake would throw a bale of hay and get a clap on the back. I'd do the same and be told not to overdo it. I was always too much or not enough. Too quiet. Not tough enough. Too opinionated. Not girly enough. The boys got the praise. I got the chores. What hurt most was that I didn't resent the work, I loved it. I loved the land, the smell of freshly turned soil, the way the wind whispered through the cornfields at night. The farm didn't ignore me. People did. When I was 15, I fixed the farm's aging tractor with parts one bought using money from cleaning houses in town. My father barely looked at it before crediting Jake. "You've always been good with machines," he said to him. Jake smirked. I said nothing. It wasn't just the farm. At school, the teachers knew me as one of the Carter boys' sister. In church, I was the girl who helped out in the kitchen while my brothers stood proudly beside Dad during services. No one asked me what I wanted. No one cared that I had dreams, too, but I did. I dreamed of owning something that was mine. Not borrowed. Not given out of pity. Mine. I dreamed of a piece of land, however small, where I could grow something beautiful. Lavender, maybe. Something soft in a world that had always been so hard. I didn't want revenge. I didn't even want attention, I just wanted to matter. And I thought, if I worked hard enough, long enough, maybe one day I would. I didn't know then that the very people I called family would be the ones to take everything from me, but they would, and when they did, they wouldn't see me coming. By the time I turned 26, I had learned the truth. No one was coming to save me. No one was going to offer me a seat at the table or hand me anything out of kindness. If I wanted a life worth living, I had to carve it out of the same hard earth my family once told me wasn't mine to touch, so I worked. Harder than ever. By day, I managed the front office at a grain elevator outside Ottumwa. By night, I filed taxes and balanced books for farmers who never thought to question the quiet girl behind the calculator. I ate meals out of Tupperware, drove a rusted-out Chevy with no AC, and lived in a second-floor rental above an old bait shop. Every dollar I made went into savings. Every hour I worked pulled me one step closer to freedom, and then, one crisp October morning, I found her, 22 acres of wild, overgrown land just outside Bloomfield. There was no house, just a crumbling barn, a crooked fence, and weeds that reached my knees, but I saw more than that. I saw home. Not the kind I grew up in, the kind I'd never had. It took nearly all of my savings and a small loan co-signed by a friend who believed in me more than my family ever did. But when the paperwork was signed and the deed was in my hands, I cried for the first time in years. Not from sadness. From pride. This land wasn't inherited. It wasn't given. I built my future with blistered hands and late nights and grit. And now it was mine. I walked the perimeter every evening, dreaming out loud to no one but the wind. Rows of lavender down the center, herbs flanking the sides, basil, thyme, rosemary. I'd build a little shop by the barn, sell soaps and oils and fresh bundles at the farmer's market. Maybe even teach workshops someday. I could already see the sign, Grace Bloom Farm. It was more than a dream. It was a declaration: I am not invisible. I am not disposable. I am enough. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was beginning. I didn't hear from my brothers much during that time. They were busy living lives I didn't envy: divorces, bad business deals, drinking too much at the same bars they'd haunted since high school. And my father? Still stubborn. Still cold. But with Mom gone, he'd softened in subtle ways. I sent him a photo of the land once. He never replied. Still, I had peace. I had purpose. I didn't know it then, but my little piece of heaven had caught more than just my eye. Jealous eyes were watching. Calculating. Waiting for the right moment to strike. I was building a life, and they were already planning how to take it from me. It was a Tuesday morning when the call came. I was halfway through sorting receipts for a client when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I nearly ignored it, but something in my chest made me answer. Is this Emily Carter? The voice asked, clinical and tired. Yes. This is Dr. Larson from Davis County Hospital. I'm calling about your father. The rest blurred together: advanced pancreatic cancer, stage 4, inoperable, 6 months if he's lucky. I heard the words, but they didn't feel real. My father was tough, unshakable, indestructible in my mind. He couldn't be dying. Not like this. Not now. I drove to Bloomfield that afternoon in silence. The land I had just begun to bring to life, my rows of lavender seedlings, my plans for spring, was left behind with the keys still in the ignition of my dream. The family farmhouse hadn't changed. The paint was more chipped, the porch sagging, but the air still smelled like diesel and dust. My father looked smaller than I remembered. Pale. Sunken. Still, his eyes were sharp. You came, he said when I walked in. I always do, I replied, setting down my bag. He didn't respond, but something flickered in his expression. Not warmth, maybe resignation. Maybe relief. My brothers had called once or twice, offered vague promises to visit, but none showed up. Not even for a day, so it was me. I moved into the old guest room and became his nurse, his cook, his company. I cleaned up his vomit. I managed his meds. I watched over him as he slept through most days and cursed through the nights. It was thankless. Lonely. But I stayed. Some part of me still believed, foolishly, perhaps, that this would change something. That caring for him now, when no one else would, might make him finally see me. Not as the forgotten daughter or the spare hand, but as the one who had always been there. We had our moments. Small ones. One night, he asked for my help adjusting his old farm ledger. I sat on the edge of his bed, watching his frail hands tremble as he tried to explain the numbers. Eventually, he gave up and said, "You were always good with this stuff." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't affection. But it was something. I held on to that moment like it meant more than it did. Meanwhile, my brothers were ghosts. They called only to ask how things were going, never what they could do to help. They had already written him off. But I couldn't. I wouldn't, because I didn't just want to do the right thing. I wanted to be seen. For once. Just once, but I should have known better. I thought giving up everything to care for him would make them see my worth. Instead, it gave them the perfect chance to steal everything I had left. It was a Wednesday when I left the house for just a few hours. My father's pain meds were running low, and the small-town pharmacy in Bloomfield had to special order one of them. I took the opportunity to grab groceries, some extra blankets, and a few things we were short on, normal errands, the kind I'd run dozens of times before. I remember feeling a strange stillness in the air that day. A sharp wind blew through the fields as I pulled out of the driveway. Maybe it was just autumn settling in. Or maybe it was something darker, a warning I didn't yet understand. When I returned later that afternoon, Jake and Matthew were there. They greeted me with awkward smiles, sitting in the living room like they owned the place. Dad was asleep upstairs. Sedated from his morning dose. They said they'd stopped by to check in and see how things were going. I didn't question it. Part of me wanted to believe maybe they'd finally decided to care, but I should have known better. 3 days later, my father died in his sleep. Quietly. Without a word. I was the only one with him when he passed. The funeral was small and cold, like the man himself. Friends from town, a few distant cousins, and of course, my brothers, clean-shaven and suddenly sentimental. They gave speeches about how strong and honorable Dad had been. I stood at the back, arms crossed, listening to the lies. Then came the will reading. I expected very little. My father had never made promises, never hinted that I'd receive anything. But I still held a sliver of hope that he'd acknowledged, even in death, all I had done for him. The years I gave. The care I provided. The life I put on hold. But when the lawyer began reading, that hope shattered. My father had left the family farmhouse to all 3 brothers equally. That didn't surprise me, but then came the second blow. The deed to the 22-acre parcel of land located off County Road 14, the lawyer read. Has been legally reassigned to Jacob Carter, by signed transfer dated September 18th. I couldn't breathe. No, I whispered. That's my land. I bought it. It's in my name. The lawyer looked uncomfortable, flipping through the file. According to this, your father signed a deed transfer. It was witnessed by Jake and Matthew Carter. My mouth went dry. September 18th, the day I'd gone into town for the pharmacy run, I stared at them, Jake, sitting there smugly, and Matthew, avoiding my eyes. They'd done it. While I was out buying Dad's medication, they forged a signature. They stole my land. My dream. I stood up, shaking. This is fraud, I said. You know this is fraud. Jake smirked. You've got no proof, Emily. Just let it go. It's not a big deal. It's just land. Just land? No, it was everything I had, and they'd stabbed me in the back while I was saving their father. I didn't sleep that night. After the will reading, I drove back to the farmhouse in silence. My hands shook the whole way. I wanted to believe it was a bad dream, that somehow, some way, it could be undone. But the papers were signed, filed, and stamped. Legal. Final. My land, was gone, stolen by the very people who were supposed to protect me. I confronted them the next morning. Jake was standing in the kitchen, pouring coffee like he hadn't just gutted me. Matthew leaned against the counter, chewing on a toothpick, acting like he couldn't care less. Why? I asked, my voice raw. Jake didn't even look up. Dad made the decision. He wanted to keep the land in the family. I am family, I snapped. I bought that land with my own money. He had no right. Matthew chuckled. You seriously thought you were going to play farmer on your little herb patch and make a living? Jake smirked. You're better off, Emily. You were always better at numbers, not dirt. I stared at them, stunned. Their arrogance. Their cruelty. They didn't even feel guilty. To them, it was just another transaction. Another thing taken from the sister who never mattered. I cared for him, I said quietly. I bathed him. Fed him. I watched him die while you two were out drinking and pretending you had no responsibilities. Jake shrugged. And we're grateful. Really? Matthew added, but this is business. You wouldn't understand. They laughed as I walked out. I didn't cry in front of them. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. But the moment I stepped into my old bedroom, I broke. Not from the loss of the land, but from the confirmation that I had never mattered to them. Not truly. Not even after everything. That night, I packed in silence. A few clothes. My laptop. My notebooks. I left behind the photos, the mementos, the little pieces of my childhood that didn't belong to me anymore. They never had. Before I left, I walked out onto the porch one last time. The wind had picked up, and the fields rustled softly in the dark. I looked out over the land that had raised me, hard, unforgiving, but mine in its own way. I thought about Mom. I wondered what she'd say if she were still alive. I wondered if she ever felt just as small. I'm done, I whispered to no one. I'm not coming back. I drove away before sunrise. No goodbyes. No explanations, they could keep the farmhouse. The lies. The legacy built on someone else's pain, but I'd rebuild. I'd rise again, no matter how long it took, and when I returned, if I returned, it would be on my terms, because I wasn't going to stay broken, I was going to come back stronger, and they wouldn't even see it coming. Des Moines didn't welcome me with open arms, but it gave me something Bloomfield never could, a clean slate. I arrived with 2 suitcases, $480 in my bank account, and no idea how I was going to survive. For the first time in my life, no one knew my name. No one expected anything from me. That terrified me, but it also set me free. I crashed on the couch of an old college friend who didn't ask questions. I got a job cleaning offices at night and another answering phones at a car rental desk during the day. Exhaustion became a constant companion, but so did determination. Every spare minute I had, I studied. I enrolled in online accounting courses and spent late nights buried in tax codes, financial models, and QuickBooks tutorials. The numbers made sense. They didn't lie. Unlike people, numbers had rules, and if you learned them well enough, they could protect you. I earned my certifications faster than I expected, fueled by rage and ambition. Within 2 years, I was working as a junior accountant for a mid-sized firm downtown. I kept my head down, worked twice as hard as anyone else, and never spoke about where I came from. I wasn't the girl who lost her land anymore. I was the woman building an empire from the ashes. By the 4th year, I'd saved enough to open my own small accounting office on the east side of Des Moines. I called it Carter Ledger Company, a subtle nod to the family name, not as a tribute, but a reminder. I hired 2 assistants, picked up local clients, and began specializing in what I knew best, agriculture. Word spread fast in the agribusiness world. I spoke their language, weather patterns, yield losses, tax advantages for seed rotations. The men who once looked past me now leaned in when I talked. Within months, I was handling books for grain elevators, co-ops, and mid-sized farms across Iowa, and that's when it happened. One day, I received a call from a contact at a debt recovery firm. A client of mine had flagged a parcel of struggling farmland in Davis County for tax forfeiture. It was poorly managed, years behind on property taxes, and facing foreclosure. I asked for the name of the owner, Jacob Carter. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard his name in 5 years. I hung up, slowly, deliberately. And then I smiled. I had done it. I had pulled myself from the dirt and built something sharp, precise, and powerful. I was no longer the forgotten daughter or the girl who cried alone on her way out of town. Now I was someone with leverage, someone with power, someone they should have never underestimated, and without them ever realizing it, I had quietly positioned myself in the one place they never imagined, above them. They say time heals all wounds. I don't know if that's true. Some wounds just learn how to scar over while you keep moving. But time does reveal things, like who someone really is when the mask slips. Jake's name popping up in my client report wasn't just a coincidence. It was the moment the tide turned. His land, the same 22 acres he stole from me, was now on the brink of foreclosure. Years of mismanagement, unpaid taxes, and short-sighted decisions had caught up with him. He'd tried converting the soil for soybeans. Failed. Tried leasing it to a neighbor. They backed out after 1 season. Now, it sat wild again, overgrown and worthless to everyone but me. To me, it was still home. I stared at the report for hours that night. Not in anger, but in absolute clarity. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. I wanted what was mine. But more than that, I wanted them to never see me coming. So, I made a call, through a trusted silent partner, a friend I'd helped build a thriving co-op. I began acquiring the liens and unpaid property taxes tied to that land. Quietly. Legally. No drama. No red flags. Jake never questioned it. Why would he? He still thought I was just the soft girl who ran away crying. Within weeks, the paperwork was in motion. I signed documents under the name of the holding company my firm managed. Everything flowed through the right channels. No direct ties. Just another routine transaction in the world of failing rural properties. 3 months later, I stood at the county records office with trembling hands as they stamped the transfer. Just like that, the land was mine again, not through a court battle. Not through screams or accusations. Just a clean, quiet reversal of what was taken from me. I didn't need to expose them, not yet. The truth would wait. For now, I just wanted to feel the dirt beneath my feet. I drove to Bloomfield the next day and parked at the edge of the land. The barn was more broken than before, leaning like a tired old man. The weeds had returned, thick and tangled, but they didn't scare me. This land had always been wild. And so had I. I walked through it slowly, fingers grazing tall grass. I whispered promises to the soil. Lavender would bloom here again. There would be rows of herbs, benches under the trees, maybe even a roadside stand. I could already see the sign, Grace Bloom Farm, reclaimed and rooted. I didn't cry, I didn't shout, I just stood there, free, whole, and silent. They took it from me once, thinking I'd never rise. But now, not only had I risen, I had returned, and the sweetest part, they still didn't know it was me, not yet. Reclaiming my land should have been enough. But as I stood in the overgrown fields of what was once stolen from me, I realized something. I didn't just want it back, I wanted the truth. Not for revenge. For justice. For me. So, I dug, quietly, carefully. I began looking into the paperwork Jake had used to take my land. The forged deeds still haunted me. I remembered the names of the supposed witnesses, local farmhands I vaguely recognized from childhood. Something about one name, in particular, stuck out, Paul Hensley. I pulled public records. Paul had moved to Minnesota 8 years ago. I found his contact through an old employer and reached out under the guise of a routine land inquiry. We chatted casually, and when I mentioned the date he supposedly signed a deed transfer in Iowa, he laughed. I was managing a grain silo in Duluth that whole year. I haven't set foot in Davis County since 2014, he said without hesitation. That was the crack I needed. With that information, I pieced everything together. The signature was fake. Paul had been used without his knowledge, and the other listed witness was likely coerced. I compiled copies of tax records, flight logs, and even a sworn affidavit from Paul. All of it pointed to one undeniable truth: the deed had been forged, it was fraud, and now, I had proof. I didn't want a spectacle. I filed the case discreetly through my attorney, letting the law speak louder than any accusation ever could. It didn't take long. The evidence was airtight. The court ruled in my favor, acknowledging that the original deed transfer had been fraudulent and malicious in nature. Jake and Matthew were both fined for falsifying legal documents and attempting to defraud a landowner. They weren't jailed, but their reputations were dragged through the mud, and in a town like Bloomfield, that's a life sentence. The news spread fast. Suddenly, the same neighbors who once saw me as just the Carter girl were stopping me in the grocery store. "I heard what they did to you, Emily. I'm so sorry. You always were the smart one. Should have been you from the start. If you ever need help rebuilding, you let me know." It was surreal. Not long ago, these people barely noticed me. Now they looked at me with something unfamiliar, respect, but I wasn't doing it for them. I did it for the girl who cried herself to sleep after losing everything. For the woman who rebuilt her life from the ground up. The truth had been buried for years, but I unearthed it, and planted something better in its place. The land was mine, the truth was mine, and for the first time, the world was finally seeing me for who I had always been, not forgotten. Unbreakable. It was a gray Thursday morning when they walked in. I was reviewing quarterly reports at my desk, sunlight breaking through the office blinds, casting soft lines across the polished wood. My name, Emily Grace Carter, CPA, gleamed in gold on the glass door behind them. A name they had once mocked. Forgotten. Erased. Now, they stood beneath it. Jake entered first. He looked smaller, somehow, his once commanding presence wilted. The arrogance he wore like armor had long since cracked. Matthew followed, thinner, grayer, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying the weight of every bad decision he'd ever made. "Emily," Jake said quietly. "Can we talk?" I studied them both. Not out of hatred, but curiosity. It was surreal, seeing them here, in my world, where I held the power. "I've got 10 minutes, I said. "Make it count." They sat. Fidgeted. Avoided eye contact. "We messed up," Matthew finally muttered. "We didn't think you'd fight back like this." "I noticed," I replied. Jake leaned forward, desperate. "Look, we're in trouble. Real trouble. We're trying to refinance, maybe sell off a few properties, but our names are tainted." I finished for him. "That tends to happen when you commit fraud and get caught." He winced. "We just thought, back then, it was just land. You weren't using it, and we figured Dad." "No," I cut in. "Don't you dare blame this on him. He wasn't a good man, but you made the choice. You lied. You stole. While I was out buying his medication, you forged his name and sold off my future." They were silent, then Jake asked the question I knew was coming. "Is there any way you can help? Maybe speak to the lenders? Vouch for us?" I stood slowly, every ounce of strength grounded in my heels. "I don't hate you," I said. "Not anymore. But I don't owe you anything. Not my voice. Not my mercy. And certainly not my help." Matthew looked like he might cry. Jake's jaw clenched, holding back whatever pride he still had left. "You should leave," I said calmly. Before I remember what it felt like to lose everything. They shuffled out, defeated. I didn't watch them go. Instead, I drove back to Bloomfield that evening. The sun was setting over my 22 acres, casting golden light across the lavender rows I had planted that spring. The barn, newly restored, stood proud against the horizon. Bees buzzed in the herb beds. The wind whispered through the trees. This was mine, not just the land, but the peace. The power. The quiet knowing that I had lost everything once, and rebuilt it better. I didn't scream. I didn't gloat. I walked the field barefoot, feeling the earth beneath me, steady, forgiving, alive. They had tried to bury me. But I had grown roots, and now, I was finally, completely, free.